I stood in the middle of their living room, every eye on me, when my wife's father leaned back in his chair and called me worthless trash. His voice carried like a judge passing sentence. "She deserves better," he said, as if the verdict had already been decided. Plates of food were still warm on the table, glasses half full, the smell of roasted turkey filling the air, but the moment froze. My wife sat rigid, her hands gripping the edge of her chair, torn between blood and vows. Her mother looked away, pretending to adjust the silverware, while her brother smirked like he'd been waiting for this scene all night. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I nodded politely, as if I had been handed instructions I intended to follow. "You're right, sir," I said, calm enough to unnerve him, and walked out of that house with nothing but my coat. No raised voice, no threats, no scene. Just silence. The winter air outside felt colder than it should have been, biting through fabric, numbing my hands, but I welcomed it. Silence is a weapon if you know how to wield it, and I had no intention of wasting mine on that dinner table. I drove home without turning on the radio. The road ahead of me a straight line of headlights and asphalt. My name is Daniel Hart, 39 years old, owner of a small construction business in Denver. I've built homes, offices, and lives out of raw materials, brick by brick. Nothing in my world has ever been handed to me. I worked nights through college, hauling lumber at dawn, drafting blueprints at midnight. I know what it is to fight for every dollar, every inch of respect. But to her father, none of it mattered. Because I wasn't from his circle, because my bank account didn't match his, because my last name didn't carry weight at his country club. As I sat in my truck outside my own house, I replayed his words in my head. Worthless trash. Not whispered, not slipped in anger, but broadcast in front of the entire family. The kind of humiliation that leaves scars if you let it. But scars don't scare me. I've lived with worse. I turned off the engine, sat in the dark, and pulled out my phone. I opened a blank note and typed 3 words: freeze. Track. Respond. Freeze meant control the moment. Hold the line. Don't let emotion dictate the play. Track meant gather everything, every detail, every angle. Respond meant act with precision, not noise. This wasn't about rage. It was about strategy. By the time I walked inside, the house was silent. My wife wasn't home yet. I poured a glass of water, set it on the counter untouched, and opened the drawer where I kept old contracts, property deeds, and partnership agreements. I laid them out on the table like maps before a campaign. Her father thought words were enough to cut me down. Tomorrow, he'd learn what silence could do. At 10 the next morning, his world would begin to crack. And it wouldn't be because I shouted louder. It would be because I didn't have to shout at all. When I woke the next morning, the echo of his words was still with me. Worthless trash. The phrase circled in my head like a vulture, picking at pride, daring me to flinch. But I didn't flinch. I poured black coffee into a chipped mug, the same one I'd used for years, and spread my documents across the kitchen table. Contracts, titles, invoices, all proof of what I'd built with my own hands. The silence of the house was sharp, but I liked it that way. It left room for planning. My wife came home late the night before, her face unreadable, her steps quiet. She didn't ask why I'd left the dinner so suddenly, and I didn't ask why she'd stayed behind. The distance between us was its own answer. By morning, she was gone again, a note on the counter saying she'd be at her parents'. It didn't bother me. Her silence was part of the game now, too. I drove to my office, a modest space above a hardware store downtown. The smell of sawdust clung to the air, the kind of scent that never leaves when you've built a life out of lumber and concrete. I unlocked the cabinet where I kept duplicates of every signed agreement, every partnership, every subcontractor payment. I handled them like weapons, because that's what they were. Her father wasn't just a man with money. He was a banker, a dealmaker, someone who thrived on leverage. He thought I had none. He believed his world was untouchable. What he didn't know was that 3 years earlier, when I'd done renovation work on his investment property, I'd been meticulous. Every permit filed, every receipt signed by him personally, every change order initialed. And I had the originals. They weren't just paperwork. They were anchors. Anchors that could sink a reputation built on control and appearances. I made copies, sealed them in an envelope, and slipped it into my briefcase. By the time the clock struck 9:30, my phone was buzzing with new emails, new invoices, new requests for bids. Life moved forward as usual, but I wasn't thinking about new projects. I was thinking about 10 o'clock. That was when his phone would start ringing, not with contractors or clients, but with consequences. I didn't send threats. I didn't type warnings. I just moved one piece into place. A quiet call to a lawyer I trusted, one who already had everything he needed from me. A transfer of documents that spoke louder than any confrontation. I didn't need to raise my voice. The signatures on those papers would speak for me. At exactly 10 a.m., my lawyer sent him a message. The deal is over. At the same time, my wife discovered the truth I had left for her, evidence of her father's double dealings, the kind of evidence that strips away illusions. Her message came quick, raw, a single line, "I hate you." And then it was my turn. My message was short, final, and sharp. Don't mess with trash. By then, the silence I had chosen at that dinner table was no longer silence. It was pressure. And pressure, when applied at the right moment, shatters even the strongest glass. When I pressed send on that final message, I didn't wait for his reply. I didn't need to. Silence afterward was the point. People like him, men who have built their lives on dominance, on speaking louder than the room, don't know what to do when their target refuses to shout back. My phone stayed on the counter, screen dark, while I stepped into the garage and started working. Sawdust rose into the air as I cut into a beam of oak, the rhythm of the blades steadier than my heartbeat. Work has always been where I regained control. By the time I stopped, an hour had passed, and still, I didn't check the phone. When I finally did, it was lit up with notifications. 3 missed calls from his number, 2 voicemails, and 1 from my wife. The voicemails I didn't listen to. I let them sit. Panic thrives in unanswered spaces. The text from my wife was shorter than the one she'd sent earlier. It said only, "Why?" I didn't reply. She didn't need answers right now. She needed time to decide if she was going to keep standing behind her father or finally step out of his shadow. At noon, I drove downtown. I had an appointment with a potential client, a small office renovation. The kind of steady work that pays bills without fanfare. I shook hands, reviewed plans, nodded at the right times. Outwardly, I was calm, professional. Inside, I felt the slow burn of strategy unfolding. I wasn't just dismantling one man's opinion of me. I was dismantling his influence, piece by piece. That afternoon, my lawyer called. He said the reaction had been immediate. Her father had shown up in his office within an hour of receiving the message, red-faced, demanding explanations, waving his hands like he was still in control. The lawyer simply pointed at the documents, the signatures, the agreements. Facts don't bend to anger. My lawyer said he left in silence, shaken for the first time. That was all I needed to hear. By evening, I sat on my porch with the sun sinking low over the rooftops, the air turning cold. I thought back to that dinner table, his smug expression, his voice cutting through the laughter. Worthless trash. It was never about me, not really. It was about control, about reminding everyone at that table that his voice was the only one that mattered. But I had flipped that script without raising mine. Now his own daughter hated him. His lawyer had cut him off, and I had marked the line he should never cross again. I didn't smile. Revenge isn't about smiling. It's about restoring balance, making sure the scales tip back where they belong. As the streetlights flickered on, I poured another glass of water, calm and steady, because the war had only just begun, and I intended to win it without ever shouting a word. The next morning, I noticed how quiet the phone had become. No more calls from him. No new messages from my wife. It wasn't peace. It was pressure, the kind of silence that builds before a storm. I poured my coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and reviewed the list I'd written the night of the dinner. Freeze. Track. Respond. I had frozen the moment when I walked out of his house without a word. I had responded when I cut off the deal and exposed his signature. Now it was time for the second step, track. Tracking doesn't mean chasing. It means watching, recording, keeping a steady eye until the cracks appear on their own. People like him believe their power is absolute. But when you push in silence, when you don't react to their bluster, they start to show where they're weakest. That day, I stopped by a property I was renovating on the edge of town. My subcontractor, a man named Harris, shook his head and told me he'd heard rumors. The banker, my father-in-law, was losing a client. Some investor pulled out after a dispute over paperwork. Harris didn't know details, but I did. The dispute was no coincidence. It was the first ripple from the documents I'd released. Ripples grow. Later, I went back to my office and opened my laptop. I logged into cloud storage where I had archived more than just contracts. Over the years, I had collected proof of conversations, side agreements, small irregularities her father thought no one noticed. I wasn't the type to weaponize secrets without cause. But now the cause was clear. I organized everything into folders, labeling them cleanly. Each one was a hammer waiting for glass. By late afternoon, I received a message from my wife. It was longer this time. She said her father looked pale, nervous, like a man who had lost sleep. She asked me if I'd done something, if I was responsible. I read the words carefully, then set the phone down without answering. Let her sit with the question. Let her decide if she wanted to know the truth or keep pretending. That evening, I sat in my truck outside their house. I didn't go in. I just watched through the windshield as lights flickered in different rooms. I saw shadows moving, the shape of her father pacing back and forth. He paused by the window once, looking out at the night like he expected enemies in the dark. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't understand yet that the enemy wasn't out there. It was already inside his walls, wrapped in his own choices. I drove home without headlights for the first mile, letting the quiet road guide me. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, heavy, like a blade resting on the table. I didn't need to swing it yet. All I had to do was wait. Because men like him destroy themselves faster than any enemy ever could. By the end of that week, I didn't have to lift a finger to see the cracks widen. Word had already spread in his circles. Businessmen notice when one of their own starts slipping, and they circle like sharks when they smell blood in the water. At the hardware store where I keep my office, two men in suits walked past my door without stopping, but I recognized them. Associates of his, men who had once treated me like I wasn't worth their time. Now they whispered to each other with faces tight, glancing over their shoulders as if guilt were contagious. I didn't approach them. I didn't need to. Silence is more powerful when it makes others fill it with their own fear. Instead, I sat at my desk and methodically opened folders on my laptop. Copies of bank statements, invoices, and email trails I had pulled from years of working alongside him on projects. Each one was a brick, and together they built a wall he wouldn't be able to climb. That afternoon, my wife showed up at my office. She didn't sit down. She stood in the doorway, her eyes sharp, her voice tight. She said her father was unraveling, that he had shouted at her mother, thrown a glass against the wall, cursed about betrayal. She asked me directly if I had done this. I didn't answer. I just met her stare and let the silence between us say more than words could. She left without another word, the slam of the door echoing behind her. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I remembered the look on her father's face at that dinner table. The arrogance, the absolute certainty that his word was law. Now, only days later, he was losing his grip on the very people closest to him. It wasn't me pushing him over the edge. It was his own reflection finally staring back at him. That evening, I parked near his office building downtown. Through the glass windows I could see him pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his tie loose, his face drained of color. At one point he slammed the phone down on his desk, so hard the sound carried across the street. A man passing by turned his head, curious, then hurried away. That's when I knew pressure was working. Not loud, not violent, just constant. Like water on stone. I drove away before he saw me. Back home, I sat in the dark and wrote down 3 new words on a fresh page. Observe. Document. Contain. He was panicking now, making mistakes, and every mistake would be one more nail in the coffin he had built for himself. All I had to do was watch, collect, and wait. The quiet man doesn't win by force. He wins by letting his enemy talk themselves into ruin. And her father was already halfway there. By the time the weekend arrived, he finally came looking for me. I knew it was coming. Men like him can't stand silence for long. They need noise, conflict, someone to wrestle with, because quiet feels like quicksand. I was in my office when the door swung open without a knock. He walked in wearing his tailored suit, but it hung differently now, like the weight of it was dragging him down. His face was pale, his jaw tight, eyes darting around the room as if he expected to find allies hiding in the corners. He didn't sit. He stood in front of my desk, fists clenched, and demanded answers. He asked me if I had sabotaged his business, if I had poisoned his family against him, if I was the reason his world was collapsing. His voice rose, echoing off the walls, each question sharper than the last. I didn't answer. I didn't even move. I just let him burn through his words while I watched calmly. like a man observing a fire he'd already set up barriers to contain. When he realized I wasn't responding, his anger shifted to desperation. He lowered his voice, tried another tactic, offering me money, promising to make things right if I just backed off. That was when I leaned forward slightly, opened my drawer, and placed a single folder on the desk. I didn't slide it to him. I didn't explain it. I just set it down and rested my hand on it. His eyes flicked to it, then back to me. He knew what it was without needing to open it. For the first time since I'd known him, he fell silent. Not because he respected me, but because silence was the only thing left to him. I didn't fill it for him. I didn't break it. I let him stand there in the weight of it until finally he muttered something under his breath and walked out. The slam of the door shook the glass in the frame, but I stayed where I was. I had already won that round without saying a word. That evening, my wife came home. She said little, only that her father had been unrecognizable lately. She admitted he seemed afraid, as if someone else had taken control of his life. She looked at me when she said it, waiting for me to confirm, but I stayed quiet. I knew the moment I gave her words, she would carry them back to him, and silence is harder to weaponize when it's shared. Later that night, I sat outside under the cold sky, my breath turning white in the air. I thought about the man who had called me worthless trash in front of everyone. I thought about how quickly arrogance can turn into panic once someone refuses to play the game. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain. All I needed to do was keep applying pressure, quietly, until he broke himself. And I could already see the cracks spreading. The following week, the mistakes began to multiply. I didn't need to push him anymore. He was unraveling on his own. Rumors reached me through subcontractors, clients, even whispers in the local coffee shop. Deals that should have been routine were suddenly collapsing. Investors were pulling out, citing irregularities in his paperwork. A project he had bragged about for months stalled when the city demanded documents he couldn't produce. I knew exactly why. Those documents were locked in my possession, signed with his hand, and they painted a picture he could never afford to show in public. I kept to my schedule like nothing had changed. Early mornings at the job site, evenings in the office, invoices filed on time, payroll delivered without fail. Outwardly, I was the steady man I had always been. Inwardly, I tracked each fracture in his empire with cold precision. I wrote down the names of every partner who abandoned him, every client who walked away, every colleague who stopped returning his calls. Each entry was another nail driven quietly, methodically, into the coffin of his authority. My wife came to me again, her voice softer this time. She said her father had been drinking at breakfast, that he stayed in his study late into the night with the door locked. She confessed that even her mother had started questioning him, something unthinkable before. She wanted to know what I had done, what I was holding over him. I didn't answer. I only listened, nodded once, and let the silence between us grow heavier. That silence was forcing her to choose. Keep clinging to her father's collapsing shadow, or step into the cold clarity of truth. That weekend, I drove past his house. The yard lights were on, but the windows told a different story. Curtains drawn, no voices, no laughter, no warmth. The man who once hosted dinners like a king presiding over his court now hid behind walls, afraid of the whispers outside. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just observed, like a soldier reconnoitering enemy territory. On Monday morning, my lawyer called again. He said my father-in-law had tried to renegotiate one of his contracts, but the counterparty laughed him out of the room. They had already seen enough to know he was finished. The lawyer asked if I wanted to press harder, if I wanted to release more. I told him no. Not yet. Let silence keep working. Silence was the pressure that cracked him better than any public scandal. That night, I sat at my desk and opened the folder again. All the documents were there, neatly arranged, waiting. I didn't need to move them yet. The beauty of silence is patience, and patience was choking him faster than any direct attack ever could. I closed the folder, switched off the light, and walked out into the night air. The war was almost over. He just didn't realize yet that he had already lost. The collapse came in public, just as I knew it would. Power doesn't die quietly behind closed doors. It crumbles where everyone can see, and that's what makes the fall permanent. It was a dinner at the country club, the kind of gathering he used to dominate. My wife insisted we attend. She said her father wanted to clear the air. I didn't argue. I put on a dark suit, drove her there in silence, and walked into that polished hall where chandeliers glowed above men who measured their worth in deals and women who traded gossip like currency. He was already there, seated at the head of the table as always, but he didn't look the same. His shoulders were hunched, his skin gray, his smile forced. He raised a glass and tried to speak with authority, but his words faltered. Halfway through his toast, his hand shook so badly that wine spilled onto the tablecloth. People glanced at each other, murmured quietly. The man who once controlled every room had lost his grip, and everyone could see it. I didn't say a word. I just sat across from him, steady, calm, my presence louder than any insult I could have thrown. He kept darting glances at me, as if I were the one pulling invisible strings, as if I were the reason his empire was turning to dust in front of his peers. He wasn't wrong. After dinner, as guests filed out, I stood near the doorway with my wife. He approached, trying to summon what little pride he had left. His voice cracked as he muttered that he hoped we could all move forward. I looked at him once, then past him, and left without responding. Silence again. Silence in front of his friends, his colleagues, his family. That silence was louder than anything I could have said. On the drive home, my wife was quiet too. Finally, she said she had never seen her father like that. She said he looked broken. I didn't answer. She didn't press me. Some truths don't need words. Later that night, I checked my phone. A message had arrived from my lawyer. More investors were cutting ties. Banks were reviewing his accounts. His grip on everything he had built was slipping away faster than he could stop it. I closed the phone, set it down, and went to bed without another thought. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the war was over, but because I knew the enemy was no longer fighting me. He was fighting himself, and he was losing. The next move would be mine, and it would be the quietest one yet. The final move began on a Monday morning, quiet and uneventful like any other. I brewed my coffee, sat at my desk, and opened the folder that had been waiting for weeks. Inside were the documents that could end everything for him. Contracts with forged numbers, hidden liabilities, signatures he had carelessly left behind. I had resisted using them until now because pressure alone was enough. But the time had come to close the account. I scanned each page, double-checked dates, confirmed every detail. I wasn't rushing. Quiet victories demand patience. When I was satisfied, I placed the files into an envelope, sealed it, and slid it across my desk. Then I picked up my phone and made a single call to my lawyer. No explanations, no speech. Just 3 words. It's time now. By noon, the envelope was delivered to the right hands. Not journalists, not police, not yet. To the board members of his own bank, the men who once followed his lead without hesitation. They were the ones who needed to see the truth first. They were the ones whose loyalty had already begun to fracture under whispers of irregularities. With the documents in their possession, silence would do the rest. That evening, I didn't go home. I drove to the edge of town and parked where I could see the lights of his office tower. Hours passed. Around 9, I watched as men in suits entered the building. Not clients, not friends. Directors. They carried briefcases and moved with purpose. At 10, his office window lit up, and shadows moved back and forth. He was fighting, gesturing wildly, pacing like a trapped animal. But by 11, the lights went dark again. The next morning, news traveled fast. He had been forced to resign from the bank. His reputation, the thing he valued above all else, was shattered. The official statement cited health reasons and a need for rest, but everyone knew the truth. His allies abandoned him, his partners distanced themselves, and the circle that once protected him dissolved overnight. At home, my wife read the announcement on her phone. She looked at me, waiting for something, an admission, a confession, maybe even comfort. I gave her nothing, just silence. She turned away, and I let her. Later that day, I received a final message from him. It wasn't anger this time. It was desperation, a plea. He said we were family, that we should find a way to repair what had been broken. I didn't respond. Family is built on trust, and he had burned that the night he called me worthless trash in front of everyone. There was nothing left to repair. I closed my phone, went to my workshop, and picked up my tools. Sawdust filled the air, steady, calm, familiar. My war was over, and I had never raised my voice. The end didn't come with fireworks or shouting. It came with silence, the same way it had started. A silence so heavy that it pressed down on him until there was nothing left to hold on to. 2 weeks after his resignation, I walked past the bank's glass tower on my way to meet a client. His name had already been scraped from the brass plaque at the entrance. A new nameplate shined in its place, clean and polished, like he had never existed. That was how quickly the world erased him once his power was gone. At home, my wife asked me if I was satisfied. She didn't ask with anger, but with a tired resignation in her voice. I looked at her, then past her, just as I had done to him. Some questions don't deserve answers, not because they're meaningless, but because the truth is already written in silence. A few days later, I received one final letter. No return address, but the handwriting was his. Inside, a single page. He wrote that he never expected me to fight back. He wrote that I had won. At the bottom, 3 words, "You were right." For a man who once stood above everyone, those 3 words were louder than any speech. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and never read it again. Life moved forward. My business grew, contracts lined up, and clients trusted me more than ever. They didn't ask about him. They didn't mention the scandal. They just handed me their plans and expected results. And I delivered, quietly, steadily, as I always had. Sometimes at night, I walked past the old country club. Through the windows, I could see new faces at the long table, raising glasses, laughing as if nothing had ever happened. His seat was empty now, and no one left space for him. That emptiness was louder than any toast. One evening, my wife stood beside me on the porch. She said she didn't know what the future held for us, but she finally understood something. Respect isn't given by birth or by wealth. It's earned by silence, by patience, by the way a man carries himself when he's pushed down. She didn't need to say more. I already knew. I sat back in my chair, the night air cool on my skin, and thought about the first moment. The night he called me worthless trash. That phrase had been meant to destroy me. Instead, it had become the spark that ended him. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made threats. I hadn't begged. I had just waited. The quiet man doesn't shout for respect. He takes it in silence. And when the dust finally settles, that silence speaks louder than anything else. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.